Job actually lived before Moses did. But Moses wrote about the beginning and Job didn't. So Genesis comes first. Does that make sense? Moses wrote the first book of the Bible. He lived 1500 BC. Job lived before that. All right, next one. And then yet the next one. The 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, I told you earlier, those make up the law. Leviticus, which was our one next to Job there, happened at the same time as the Exodus, during that time. God gave a bunch of rules and regulations for the priests so that the children of Israel's worship system would be proper. The book of Leviticus is the book of Levites. It was the priests and Levites who carried out the ministry in the tabernacle. That's why it's the book of Leviticus, the Levites book. How to sacrifice, when to sacrifice, why to sacrifice. That's pretty much what Leviticus is about. So it doesn't carry our timeline further. It's just additional information. And then Deuteronomy. Right after the 40 years, before Moses died and before Joshua took the children of Israel in, Moses met with the children of Israel again and said, listen, I'm going to remind you about everything that happened up to this point. And he basically tells the story over again, gives the law all over again. Talks about the 10 Commandments again, how God took them through the wilderness, talks about a little bit about Leviticus, reminds them about where they've been. Deuteronomy comes from, I think it's Latin, deutero, twice, nomos, law. Second law, the giving of the law again. That's really what the English version of Deuteronomy should be, the giving of the law again. Deuteronomy's shorter, I guess. But we should change it, don't you think? Deuteronomy, what's that? Second law, that's what it is, giving again. So those 5 books make up the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. I told you about Joshua's, I told you about Judges. But during the book of Judges, something else happened, and it has its own separate book. It's the book of Ruth. If you opened up to the book of Ruth, it would say something like this. During the days that the judges judged the land, there was a famine. All right. I told you about the sin cycle. Remember that? Sin cycle? Children of Israel turned their back on God. God would send in their enemies. Their enemies would conquer them. They'd cry out for deliverance. God would send them a judge. They would walk with God till the judge died. They'd turn their back on God. God would send in their enemies. Well, before their enemies would be sent in, and during the time of their sin, God would give them famine and stop the rain, also drought. Because according to the law, the Torah, Deuteronomy, God said that if they didn't obey him, he'd stop the rain. So if the children of Israel ever had a harvest problem, they knew they had a spiritual problem. That's how closely they were tied to God. So if the rain stopped and the harvest stopped, they should know, uh-oh, something's wrong, we're in trouble. So Judges starts off, and then Ruth starts off saying there was a famine in the land during the days of the Judges. So you know in the sin cycle where that is. It was before their enemies or during their enemies. They weren't walking with God. But later on, Ruth and her family go back to Israel because it says the Lord had visited them and sent them rain. So this is when a judge had just kicked out the bad guys and they started walking with God again. So we know where in the sin cycle, but we don't know which judge it is. That we don't know. All right, so they asked for a king. We got 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. In the New Testament, we have 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They all talk about Jesus' life from 4 different authors' perspectives. Well, those 2 long boxes under 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings, fill those in. Those are 1 and 2 Chronicles. It's the same data as the second part of 1 Samuel all the way through 2 Kings. Next one as well. Same data from a different perspective. For example, and I'm just reading this now at home for my own private time. In 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, you got the story of Ahab, that wicked, wicked king of Israel, one of the worst kings of Israel, and even his wife is notorious. Her name was Jezebel. This was the Ahab that Elijah the prophet confronted. Well, there's like, I don't know, I'm just throwing this out because I didn't count, but like 5 or 6 chapters in Kings dealing with Ahab, but only like 1 chapter in Chronicles dealing with Ahab. So he gets his full story in the Kings, but only a reference in the Chronicles. And Chronicles gives us other information that the Kings doesn't have. So it's the same story, same timeline, different information, just like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do for the life of Jesus. You'll notice at the very end of Kings, right under Chronicles is something, but I missed out on the Psalms, and I got to give that to you. So if you follow the Chronicles straight down, you'll see that dotted line and then 3 names: Saul, David, Solomon. You see that on your paper or up here? Right under David is the Psalms, because King David wrote most of the Psalms. And if you know the timeline, I told you when King David lived. He was one of those big periods, 1000 BC. All right? King David wrote the Psalms. Most of the Psalms then were written by 1000 BC. Isn't that crazy that you have in your hand right now, or in the pew in front of you, a book whose data has writings that go back over 3,000 years? That is just so cool. And we live by this. It's amazing. Well, his son is known to be the wisest man who ever lived, Solomon. And he wrote a few books too. He wrote most of the Proverbs, he wrote Ecclesiastes, and he wrote Song of Solomon. And those are the next 3 right there. Solomon, his son, wrote those. So since his dad was David, I still put him at 1000 BC. I mean, it's basically the same time frame. Now, what I didn't tell you in my quick jog through those 11 books is that Israel actually divided into 2 nations. They had war, they had civil war, just like we did. We came together as one nation. They split apart into 2 separate nations. They had Canada to the north and the United States to the south. They had Israel to the north and Judah to the south, and both were Jewish nations. You notice there's an Israel timeline and a Judah timeline, and you'll notice it starts right after Solomon, because it was Solomon's son, King Rehoboam, who messed up the kingdom. Here's what happened. Solomon sinned, David sinned. Because of Solomon's sin, one of his military leaders and he got into a fight. And his military leader fled to Egypt. But he was like rebelling against Solomon at the same time, trying to do a coup. Couldn't quite get it. He was working it from the sides. Now, Solomon dies. Rehoboam becomes king. This guy comes back from Egypt, takes a bunch of leaders from the northern tribes, goes to him in a public format, and says, listen, your dad was mean to us. The taxes were too high. The slavery was too intense. I know it's not called slavery. It was forced labor. But it was too much. Back off a little, King Rehoboam. And if you do, we will serve you. So this guy who was ready to throw a coup against Solomon said, hey, I'll submit to your leadership if you just chill. Be good. He said, give me a few days. Let me think on what you said. So he goes back and he talks to his buddies, fellow princes and dukes and such, and says, what should we do, guys? He said, those scumbuckets, beat them, abuse them, tell them you're going to be harder. Don't let them get away with this. They tell you what to do now, there'll never be an end of it. Don't be weak. But the older, wiser people said, no, no, no. This is a golden opportunity. Show them you care for them. Show them respect. They will serve you forever. Well, Rehoboam was a knucklehead, went with the advice of the young, immature guys instead of the advice of the silverheads. And he came back and said, I'm going to take it out on you guys. So there was a coup. There was a rebellion and a revolt, and the nation split in 2, and it wasn't healed again until the days of Jesus, really. In a sense, the healing never came. In a sense, it came after Babylon. It's kind of confusing. No time for that right now. But that's why you have the 2 timelines. And on the one, you got Israel on the top, Judah on the south, 10 tribes to the north, 2 to the south. Israel was a bigger kingdom. But you notice how the Israel line stops before it gets to that dotted line. Israel was destroyed, never to be revitalized. Judah is the one that went into Babylon, and then they came back again. They survived. Now, there were representatives of all 12 tribes in both nations. So none of the 12 tribes disappeared, as it were. They intermarried and intermingled. But the nation of Israel, gone forever. The nation of Judah, from which now all the descendants are called Jews. That's why all Israelite people are known as Jews, because the surviving nation was the nation of Judah. Interesting little tidbit for you.